So my name is Harmony Dust Grillo, and well, it's actually Harmony Grillo, but I used to be Dust, so I still throw that in there, but it's Grillo. My husband wants you to know it's Grillo. And I'm the founder and executive director of Treasures, and you've heard my name kind of mentioned throughout the night, and I just got a flag, a freaking flag. Like, who gets a flag? What? Who gets a flag? I never even heard of that. When they told me, I'm like, what are you talking about? Anyways, but really, I do want to make sure that everyone in this room knows that this is not a one-woman show. This is not the Harmony Grillo show. Like, Treasures is run by people, by incredibly dedicated, amazing people, most of them volunteers, and they are the heartbeat, they're the DNA, they are everything. And so we've actually had consultants, some of them who are in this room, who have looked at our operating budget and their jaw fell to the floor because they couldn't believe we're able to do on such a small budget what we do, but it's because of the people. So I just want to acknowledge them, and they put on this event tonight, so thank you. So how many of you guys have been to a gala before? Actually, how many haven't? That's it. Oh, that's wonderful. Awesome. Awesome. Wonderful. So I can still remember 15 years ago standing outside of the strip club that I used to work at and feeling like I was sitting outside of a prison that had once held me captive, and I knew I had to do something to reach the women that were still working there. And I started writing notes on the backs of postcards and putting them on the cars because I knew that's where the women parked. And it was from that moment that the entire vision of Treasures was birthed. And I never would have imagined that 15 years later, we would be here and doing what we're doing. And outreach, Treasures has three main areas of focus: outreach, care, and training. Our outreach efforts are directed towards strip clubs, towards the porn industry, in juvenile detention centers, and also in online forums where women and girls are being sold and solicited for sex. We offer care to the women in the form of peer mentoring, one-on-one mentoring with them. We have weekly support groups, and we also just have community-based events and really try to develop a support system and community around the women. We do Thanksgiving, we do Christmas, we do family, we do baby showers. We do whatever it is that the women need, and as much as we can to support them so that they can live the healthy and flourishing lives that they were created to live. And we also, the training portion, the training focus of Treasures is that we train other people to replicate this model of outreach in their cities. And so to date, we've had the honor of training outreaches in over 120 cities on 6 continents. And I do this because I remember what it was like to feel alone and feel trapped and not really have many resources. And I still remember the first night I walked into a strip club to work my first shift. I was 19 years old, and the environment was completely foreign to me, and yet there was something very familiar about it. And the reason it was familiar to me is, like 90% of women in the sex industry, I had a history of childhood sexual abuse. And so while I had never been in a strip club before, my history of abuse in many ways conditioned me. It prepared me for working in the sex industry because I was already comfortable with being sexualized. I was comfortable with being objectified because that's what my history of abuse had conditioned me to feel comfortable with. And those are pretty much job requirements. You have to be willing to be sexualized and objectified. And when you make someone an object, you strip them of their humanity. You dehumanize them. And when you think about it, some of the most horrendous atrocities in all of human history were made possible by dehumanization. When you look back at the wars that have been fought, when you look at back at the genocides, when you look back at the transatlantic slave trade, when you look back at the Holocaust, all of these tragic, horrific things were made possible by first stripping a people group of their humanity. This process of dehumanization. And it's dehumanization that's basically like a mental loophole that gives us permission to harm another person. And that is the context that has to exist for exploitation and trafficking to happen. And unfortunately, it is a cultural context that is existing today in our world, where women are often treated as objects and as sexual things. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that later, but for now I'll just kind of leave that there. The other thing I remember about my first night working in the strip club is I remember walking up to the DJ booth, and he looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Harmony." And he turned around and he wrote in a black dry erase marker on the whiteboard behind him, and he wrote Harmony. And I said, no, take it down. I'll be Monique. And it's interesting because I hadn't heard Reagan's story yet, but essentially Monique was the persona that I created that helped me to survive the sex industry. It was a mask that I hid behind, but Monique wasn't a real person. Monique was a compilation of other people's fantasies. Monique was whoever the customer that night wanted Monique to be. And most of us in the industry create these kind of alter identities. Helps us survive. The problem with it is that also I began to lose sight of who I really was. I began to be further and further disconnected from who Harmony was. And who Harmony was, the Harmony that walked into the strip club that night at 19 years old was a very broken and very vulnerable girl. I had come from a background of where there was domestic violence in my house. My mother was a trafficking victim. They wouldn't have used that terminology at the time, but she was trafficked into prostitution in Vegas as a teenager. She herself dealt with a substance abuse issue. My stepdad, who raised me, was dealt drugs. And so I came from a background of a lot of chaos, a lot of violence. On top of it, the neighborhood I lived in was also very violent. Just to give you an example, I remember one day watching someone stabbed to death 10 feet away from me. I was a child, probably 10 years old, and I covered my brother's eyes. He was 5, and I just stood there frozen for a second, watched it happen, and then turned around and ran home and didn't even tell my mom about it, because that is how normal violence was in my life. And I say that because I am a social worker. I have an MSW from UCLA, and I believe that context and environment is important. And that environment of violence left me with this very deep desire to feel a sense of safety that I never had. And that informed some of the choices that I made later in life. At 13 years old, one of my abusers, are you guys good? Do we need a breath? I'm used to sharing it again and again and again. Some of you, if you're new here, you might be like, what? And I can say all of this as seemingly casually as I am because my heart is healed and my past doesn't have a grip on me. Trust me, there was a time when I would not have said any of this into a microphone. But one of my abusers was my mother's boyfriend, and at that point I started standing up for myself. I ran away from home to get away from him, and she said, "Harmony, come home, he's gone, everything's fine, come back." And I went home, only my mother decided to leave with her boyfriend. So she left me at 13 with my 8-year-old brother with $20 and a book of food stamps. And after the food stamps and the money was gone, I started stealing from the liquor store to support my brother and I. And it was that summer that I became involved with an older boy in my neighborhood. And I saw knight in shining armor, but now I look back and see that he had every intention of exploiting me. You know, I wanted to feel that sense of safety and protection, and he told me, "I've got your back, I'll take care of you, I won't let anything happen to you." And he, you know, when he was around, I didn't have to steal because he would buy us food. I felt provided for. And so I became very deeply attached to him in what I now know is a trauma bond, and ended up in a 7-year-long abusive relationship with him that ended up leading me into the sex industry, working as a stripper. And he became my pimp. Every night I came home, gave him all my money. And my life was, I really didn't think I would live to see 21. I certainly didn't think I'd be handed a flag. Like crazy. Can you guys believe that? Anyways, I still can't get over it. But I really didn't think I'd live to see 21. And for me, the catalyst for change began with something as simple as a friendship. She loved me unconditionally. And actually, I had many friends who loved me unconditionally. One of them sitting right here, picked me up from bus benches in the middle of the night, kept me from being on the streets. Thank you, Melissa. But this friend that I had, she had actually just read a book called Boundaries. And she had some good boundaries. She had respect for herself. She she loved me. She didn't judge me. And her friendship really, and her access to her life and seeing the kind of life that she lived made me realize that there was something else that I wanted and I saw in her life. And I began going to church, and I began going with her to these classes called Monday Night Life Solutions. And in those classes, we would go through books and curriculum by Drs. Henry Cloud and John Townsend, beginning with Boundaries. And those books changed my life. The book Boundaries, the subtitle is When to Say Yes, When to Say No, How to Take Back Control of Your Life. And that is exactly what I needed, is to figure out when to say yes. Well, actually, I had no problem with yes, because yes, everything was yes. In the sex industry, everything is yes, right? But I didn't have what they refer to as my no muscle. I didn't know how to say no, and I certainly didn't know how to take back control of my life. I had given all of my power away to the boyfriend pimp person. And so, I did a lot of things to get where I'm standing today. People ask me, what does it take to get well? What does it take to get free? It takes whatever it takes. It takes whatever it takes. I had to fight for my healing. I had to fight for my freedom. I went to individual therapy, group counseling, Celebrate Recovery, Grief Recovery, every kind of recovery. And it's not fun, but it's worth it, and you're worth it. I never could have imagined back then showing up to those classes like, is it really okay if I say no to someone, right? That I would be standing here today with the honor and privilege of introducing you to Dr. Henry Cloud. He is a world-renowned psychologist, leadership expert, and author of about 1 million of the best books on recovery you ever could imagine. So please help me welcome Dr. Henry Cloud.